On the morning of the wedding, I pressed my dress and laid it gently across the edge of the bed, pale blue with silver thread at the cuffs. The same one I wore to my husband's retirement party 15 years ago. It still fit. I had even set aside a small envelope with a card and a check, not flashy, but thoughtful. I tucked it beside a delicate handkerchief, one with white lace edges I'd embroidered myself. It was a small thing, but I believed a grandmother should give something meaningful to the bride. The phone call came just as I was pinning my hair, short, cold, my daughter-in-law's voice, not trembling or nervous, just distant, efficient, like a woman scratching an item off a long to-do list. She said plans had changed, the guest list had been tightened, no room for extended family. I'm not sure what I said in return. I just remember sitting back down on the edge of the bed, staring at the dress folded beside me, then folding it once more, this time into a deeper silence. I'm Mary Carson, I'm 72. And that was the moment I knew they didn't see me anymore. The way you might walk past a dusty frame on a hallway wall once admired, now just part of the wallpaper. That's what I'd become. Not a person, not a presence, just an old woman taking up space on the seating chart. I'd never missed a birthday, not one. From the day my son held his first child in his arms, I had been there, casseroles in the freezer, tiny mittens hand-knit before the baby even arrived. And yet, when the boy became a man and his bride walked down the aisle, I was uninvited. She said it like it was nothing. But it wasn't nothing. It was the sharp edge of something that had been building for years. Subscribe, and tell me in the comments where you're watching from. Thanks. That morning, I didn't cry, not right away. I sat in the quiet, listening to the faint ticking of the mantel clock, the one George gave me for our 35th wedding anniversary. The walls seemed to lean in around me, like they too were holding their breath, unsure how to console. A woman who had just been erased. I watched the clouds shift through the kitchen window, pale sunlight pushing through in soft patches. A part of me thought, maybe they'd call back, maybe my son would realize, maybe this was all a misunderstanding. But no one called. I imagined the venue, the music, the crisp linens folded into careful fans. I imagined the photographer lining up the family portraits, my chair empty, my name absent from the program, my seat given to someone newer, shinier, more relevant. There's a particular ache that comes from being edited out of your own family's story. It isn't rage, it isn't even sorrow. It's something quieter, something that floats to the bottom of your chest and settles there, heavy and still. I made tea. I sat on the porch with the cup warming my palms. I watched a sparrow struggle to pull a ribbon from a bush for its nest, the way it tugged and tugged. Wings flapping in the still air, I don't know why, but I felt a strange kinship with that little bird, trying to hold on to something already being pulled away. I could have made a scene, called my son, pleaded, shamed, but I didn't. There's something in you that folds when your children let you down. A softness that once held them now breaks apart quietly. Instead, I sat with the silence, and then I wrote a letter. It wasn't dramatic, just honest. I wrote it to the bride, the girl I had barely gotten to know. I told her a little story about the day her groom was born, how his father had missed the delivery by 10 minutes because of a snowstorm, and how I had held that boy against my chest and promised him I'd always show up for him. I didn't ask her to change her mind. I didn't ask for an invitation. I simply wished her well, told her she was joining a family that once meant the world to me, that I hoped she'd know the warmth of it, too, if she ever needed it. I sealed it, addressed it to the bridal suite. I mailed it that same day, and then I got up, put the dress back in the closet, packed away the handkerchief and the card. I heated leftover soup and watched an old documentary with the volume just loud enough to fill the corners of the room. No one knocked on the door. No one called to check in. Later that evening, I watered my peace lily, clipped a few dead leaves, sat at the kitchen table with a small glass of sherry. The clock chimed 9. I raised the glass not in a toast, but in quiet acknowledgement, a ritual of closure. I suppose I sipped. And I let the silence stay, because there's something sacred in being left behind. It teaches you the shape of your own outline, the sound of your own breath, the weight of your own worth when no one else bothers to carry it. And that night, alone in the soft hush of an empty house, I finally heard it clearly. Not the rejection, not the insult, but the truth beneath it. They no longer saw me, but I still saw myself. I didn't always live in silence. There was a time when my life moved in rhythms of service, morning lunchboxes, late-night laundry, cycles, scraped knees, and birthday streamers taped above the fireplace. It's strange to think how easily people forget the days that built them, how memory fades not for lack of love, but for lack of effort. When my son, Daniel, was born in 1976, I was only 24. George and I had just moved into a small brick house near the edge of town. It had creaky floors and an avocado-colored kitchen, but it was ours. I remember rocking Daniel by the window, watching the trees shift with the seasons while his breath tickled the curve of my collarbone. There was so little money back then. George worked at the steel mill and took evening shifts. I cooked from scratch, clipped coupons, mended everything twice. But we had love, and we had time. And I gave both freely. As Daniel grew, I became the quiet backbone of the house. Homework, help, science fair, volcanoes, Easter egg hunts even when snow still lined the yard. I didn't have a career outside those walls, but I had a role. And I held it tightly. I thought if I did everything right, if I baked his favorite cookies on Fridays and remembered the names of his friends and clapped at every school assembly, I'd never become invisible. I don't say this for pity. I say it because it matters. We don't just appear in rocking chairs one day with our hair gone silver and our voices smaller than they used to be. We build our lives out of the days we gave away. I gave Daniel all of mine. When he went off to college, I felt pride laced with grief. His dorm room smelled of new bedding and nervous ambition. I folded his shirts carefully, smoothed the sheets. Once more before leaving, he hugged me quickly, already looking ahead to the life waiting just beyond the campus gates. I didn't cry until we were halfway home. It was the same when he got married. A simple ceremony in the backyard of his wife's parents. I remember the white lights strung across the hedges, how the air smelled of roses and citronella candles. I brought my famous peach cobbler. I wore a pearl pin that had belonged to my mother. I gave a quiet toast when no one else had words. That was the first time I felt it, the shift. His new wife didn't quite meet my eyes. She smiled politely, thanked me for the dessert, and drifted away. I brushed it off. She was young, overwhelmed. I told myself she'd come around, that love, like soil, simply needed time to root. But over the years, the invitations grew fewer. The holidays shifted to their house, then became just the four of us this year. Hope you understand. I did. I always did. Still, I kept giving. Christmas gifts sent by mail when they didn't. Visit birthday cards with checks tucked inside. When their second son was born prematurely, I drove 3 hours with a crock pot of chicken soup and a hand-knit blanket. She didn't let me hold the baby, said he was fussy today. I smiled and left the food anyway. That's the thing about mothers, or at least the kind I was. We aren't waiting for applause. We're just hoping someone notices we kept the light on every time they needed something. I gave. When Daniel's car broke down, I sent money. When his wife's mother passed, I baked casseroles and sent flowers. When they needed a babysitter last minute, I changed my plans. And when no one needed me, I still stayed available, just in case. I remember once, about 8 years ago, Daniel called and said he had the flu. His wife was out of town. The boys were small then. I came over in under an hour, cleaned the kitchen, washed the sheets, held a cool cloth to his forehead like I had when he was 10 and couldn't sleep through a fever. He barely said thank you when I left. I told myself he was tired. But what I didn't see then was that the ledger of effort had become one-sided. Their lives marched forward, full of noise and motion, while mine stood like an old tree, solid, steady, mostly overlooked. I never expected grandeur, not jewelry or inheritances, or rooms named after me, but I thought foolishly that I had earned a seat at the table, not as an obligation, but as someone who mattered. So many little moments kept me believing I still did, like when my youngest grandson, Elliot, brought me a crayon drawing and said it was Grandma's flower garden, or when Daniel sent me a photo of the boys playing catch and said, "Thought you'd like this," or when his wife once thanked me for watching the boys so she could sleep in. These scraps, they sustained me. I held them like tiny medals, evidence that I still belonged. But time has a way of eroding things, not all at once, slowly, like water wearing down stone, a missed call, a birthday forgotten, a story I wasn't told until it had already ended, a joke they shared at the table that I didn't understand because I hadn't been there when the memory was made, and then this wedding. A moment that should have been mine to witness, quietly, from the back row, a ribbon in my hair, a tissue in my purse, a glance between grandmother and groom before he walked to the altar. Instead, I was erased before I ever arrived. Sometimes I wonder if they remember what I gave, not the physical things, the money, the rides, the soup, but the quieter offerings, the listening ear when Daniel needed to vent, the forgiveness I gave when they forgot anniversaries, the silence I kept when they made choices I didn't agree with. They never saw the corners I rounded off for them, and I never asked them to. But now, looking back, I wish I had kept a little more for myself, a little more dignity, a little more voice, a little more space that was mine alone, untouched by the weight of obligation. Still, the truth is I gave it all because I loved them. I still do, even now. But love doesn't mean you keep showing up to be dismissed. And this time, when they left me out, I finally understood. I wasn't just left off the guest list. I was no longer part of the family they were building. And that hurt more than any phone call ever could. You don't notice the first shift. It comes dressed in politeness, in silence, in the way someone says your name a little less often, or no longer hugs you quite as long. It's not cruel, not at first. It's just less inclusion, less interest, less warmth. Then one day you realize you've been moved to the outer circle, and no one sent a memo. After Daniel married, I told myself it would take time. She was finding her place in the family. She didn't know the rhythms of our life yet. I made excuses, soft ones, like old quilts used to patch what didn't quite fit. But the pattern didn't change. She kept her distance, and over time, so did Daniel. At first, it was the holidays. We used to rotate Thanksgiving with us, Christmas with her parents, and so on. But one year, the plan changed last minute. They decided to stay home, just the 4 of them, she'd said. Like I wasn't part of that number anymore. Another year, I got an email, not even a call, saying they were spending it in Arizona with friends. I still roasted the turkey, though. I still lit the candles on the table, even if I was the only one there to see them. It wasn't one big moment, it was 100 little ones. Like the time I showed up for my grandson's school play after they forgot to mention it had been moved to the morning. I arrived just as the janitor was locking up. The stage was empty, and my seat had never been filled, or when I saw photos online of a birthday party I hadn't been invited to. There was a cake I recognized I had made it the year before, but this time it sat on a different table, in a different house, surrounded by smiles I wasn't part of. When I asked Daniel about it later, he said they kept it small. But I saw the crowd in the photo. I counted at least 20 people, none of them me. I stopped asking questions after that. Then came the control, subtle, but firm. If I offered advice even gently, it was met with tight smiles or a change of subject. When I brought over a bag of clothes for the boys, I noticed they were never worn. I once suggested a storybook I used to read to Daniel, and my daughter-in-law said, without looking at me, "We're trying to avoid outdated gender roles." I nodded, left the book on the kitchen counter, found it in the donation bin a week later. You'd be surprised how loud that silence can be, the sound of not being needed. They didn't want confrontation. They wanted me to fade, and for a long time I let myself dim. I took shorter visits. I called less often. When I was invited, I brought flowers, stayed polite, never lingered. I watched my grandsons grow up through filtered photos and brief, awkward hugs. I learned to measure love by how long it took for someone to reply to my messages. I started keeping a little notebook, not out of bitterness, just because writing helped me breathe. I jot down the small things that made my chest ache. December 17th called to wish Elliot happy birthday. No answer, left a message, no call back. April 2nd drove by their house, Easter decorations up, no invitation again this year. July 15th dropped off cookies, no one came to the door, heard voices inside. None of these things on their own were enough to burn a bridge, but together they built a wall I could no longer climb. I never told anyone, not even the friends I played cards with on Fridays. There's a kind of shame in being unwanted by your own. You carry it quietly, like a cracked teacup you still drink from because it once belonged to someone you loved. Sometimes I'd sit in my garden and stare at the wind chimes, a gift from Daniel when the boys were toddlers. The sound reminded me of laughter that used to echo through the house, sticky fingers. Bedtime stories, tiny shoes by the door. Now it was just me and the hum of bees among the lavender. I wondered often what I had done wrong. Had I overstepped, been too available, too sentimental? Maybe I loved them too loudly, or not in the language they wanted. But love shouldn't need translation. It should be understood in the effort, in the showing up, in the consistency of presence. Still, the distance grew. They stopped telling me things. I'd hear about big changes from neighbors, Daniel's new job, the boys' sports teams. Even a vacation they took to Ireland, a place I always wanted to see, a place Daniel and I used to talk about visiting when he was a boy and I read him Irish folktales before bed. And now he had gone, without a word. I stood in my kitchen the day I found out, held the kettle under the tap and felt the water fill until it spilled over my fingers. Still, I didn't move. I just watched it overflow. That's how it felt. 100 little drops, all adding up. Until there's no space left, and even then, you keep pouring. Because you don't know how to stop loving them, because they are your blood, your heartbeat, your history. But even a heart that's steady can learn to slow down. Even a mother can learn to let go. I didn't say anything the day they missed. My birthday, no card, no call, just silence. I baked myself a small cake, lit one candle, sat at the table and sang not the birthday song, but an old hymn I used to hum when Daniel had night terrors. It soothed me more than I expected. And that night, when I turned out the lights, I whispered something I hadn't dared say aloud before. Not to them, to myself. Maybe I deserve more than this. Maybe the problem isn't that I love too much. Maybe it's that they don't know how to receive it anymore. And maybe, just maybe, I'm allowed to stop offering it where it's no longer wanted. It happened on a Thursday, late afternoon. The light was beginning to slant across the windows, soft and golden. I had just finished deadheading the roses out back and came in to wash my hands. The phone rang, not the landline, which rarely did any more, but my mobile, an unfamiliar number. I hesitated before answering, assuming it was one of those calls. about car warranties or surveys, but it wasn't. It was the bank. The woman on the line had a kind voice, one of those slow, practiced tones used when delivering delicate news. She explained, as gently as she could, that a withdrawal had been flagged on my account unusual activity. She called it a large transaction, one I hadn't made. She asked if I had recently signed over co-ownership of my house. My hand, still damp from the faucet, went cold. I hadn't signed anything. The last time I'd updated paperwork was 4 years ago, when I set up my will after George passed. Everything had been in my name since then, the mortgage paid, the deed secured in a fireproof box upstairs. The house wasn't extravagant, but it was mine. The only thing I'd managed to hold onto all these years. I told her no. I had not signed anything. And then I heard the clicking of keys, the paper shuffle, and finally the confirmation there was a signature on file, mine, or rather, something that resembled it. A deep unease settled in my chest. I hung up, sat down at the table. The sun had faded behind clouds by then, and the house suddenly felt dim. I reached for the drawer where I kept my folders, pulled out the deed, the will, the list of emergency contacts. Everything was as I remembered, but then I noticed the date the woman had mentioned, April 14th. That was the week Daniel had come by his first visit in months. He'd said he needed help with taxes. Asked if he could look through some of my old files. I had gone to the kitchen to make tea while he sorted through the cabinet in the study. He had even thanked me on his way out, told me I'd made things easier. I thought he meant the tax forms. I didn't sleep that night. I laid in bed, the ceiling fan whirring above me, each rotation slicing through the dark like a slow metronome. I kept going over it in my head, trying to find a version of the story where he didn't know, where he hadn't done it on purpose, where someone else had accessed the documents, where this was all a mistake. But it wasn't. I called the bank again in the morning, asked for a copy of the paperwork. They mailed it within the hour. I opened it slowly, each page heavy with implication. There, on the bottom of the transfer form, was my name, my signature, except it wasn't. The letters were close, but shaky. Off in places where my hand would never waver. The C in Carson leaned to far left. The M in Mary lacked the loop I always added, a habit I picked up as a girl from watching my mother write hers. Someone had tried to be careful, but not careful enough. It wasn't just a mistake, it was forgery, and it was his. I sat with the paper for a long time, not crying, not shaking, just still. My breath was shallow, as if my body was trying to make less noise, as if grief could be startled. There's a different kind of heartbreak that comes when someone steals from you, not just money, not just property, but trust, legacy, respect. For years, I had endured distance. I had forgiven silence. I had swallowed slights and rearranged my needs so that their lives could run smoother. I had accepted that I would no longer be at the center, that age changes how people see you, how they prioritize you. But I had never imagined betrayal would come with a pen. A lie, a signature that wasn't mine, used to take the last piece of stability I had left. It wasn't even about the house. Not really. It was about what the house represented. Every nail, every brick, every coat of paint, they carried memories. Daniel's height marked on the door frame. George's tools still lined up on the pegboard. In the garage. The kitchen where I burned the first roast trying to impress my in-laws. The garden I planted the spring I turned 50, it was all I had left that was truly mine. And now they had tried to take even that. I didn't call him. I couldn't. The words wouldn't have come out right. They would have been too sharp or too soft, and neither would have protected me. I wasn't looking for a fight. I wasn't even looking for an apology. I just needed to understand why. But the truth is, I already knew. It was easier to take from someone you no longer see as fully human, as relevant, as someone whose feelings mattered to them. I was no longer a mother or a person who deserved a conversation, just an obstacle to be handled. Quietly, legally, swiftly, I put the papers in a folder, slid them into the back of the filing cabinet. Then I called a lawyer. She was younger than I expected, kind, efficient. She asked the right questions. And when I showed her the signature, she didn't hesitate. "This isn't yours," she said, looking me squarely in the eye. "We'll take care of it." It was the first time in years someone had spoken to me that way, with certainty, with respect. I didn't tell Daniel. I let the law speak for me. The silence that followed was immediate. No more calls, no texts, just the vacuum that follows. Exposure. And I didn't fill it. I didn't chase it. I didn't explain myself to people who had already decided I wasn't worth their truth. What surprised me most wasn't the betrayal. It was how calm I felt after, not numb, not angry, just done, as if something inside me had finally finished closing a door that had been swinging open and shut for too many years. I looked around the house that week with new eyes, and for the first time, I stopped asking what I had done wrong. Instead, I started asking what I still had left to protect, because now I knew the final line had been crossed and there was no going back. After the paperwork was filed and the lawyer assured me the title would be corrected, I didn't tell. A soul, not the women I played dominoes with at the church centre, not my neighbour Evelyn, who always noticed when something was off, and certainly not Daniel. That door, once slightly ajar out of habit and hope, now stood closed, not slammed. Just sealed. I stopped reaching out. No more texts, no more holiday reminders. No more cautious questions like, "Are the boys playing soccer this season?" I didn't wish them well. I didn't wish them harm either. I simply stepped back finally, and without a sound. Silence can be a kind of strength, not the brittle kind that comes from holding back anger, but a quieter, older strength like stone weathered smooth by wind. I had given them years of my voice, my time, my presence. Now I gave them nothing. It was the first time in decades that I allowed myself to retreat without guilt. I still lived my life. Of course, the days didn't stop. The sun still rose. The birds still gathered at the feeder outside the kitchen window. I began to wake. Earlier, the mornings had a gentleness to them that I hadn't noticed before, the way the light touched the cupboards, the way the kettle's whistle curled through the house like a familiar song. I started writing again, nothing elaborate, just small thoughts in a brown leather journal I'd found at the bottom of a drawer, sometimes a line or two, sometimes just a single word. Peace, enough. Hollowed, heal. I didn't plan what I wrote. I just let it come. It was as if the more I withheld from them, the more space I found inside myself. I changed little routines without meaning to. I rearranged the living room. I stopped cooking dinner at 6 and started eating when I was actually hungry. I moved the guest towels from the linen closet, the ones I used to set out when the boys visited, and replaced them with the ones I liked best, thick, soft, sea green. No one was coming to stay anyway. One afternoon, I went through a box of old voicemail tapes George had kept from the answering machine days. I don't know why, nostalgia, maybe, or longing, or just a need to hear voices that had once meant something. The tapes crackled with static and memory. There was one from Daniel. He must have been 9. "Hi, Mom, I'm at Josh's house. Don't worry, I fed the cat. Love you." I played that one twice, maybe 3 times, not because it hurt, but because I needed to remember that once. He had loved me freely, without calculation, without shame, just a boy calling his mother to say hello. Some days were harder than others. Grief doesn't disappear just because you decide to stop hurting. It lingers like dust in the corners, quiet and present. I missed them. I missed being part of something, of someone's story. But I didn't miss the ache of feeling like a burden. I didn't miss the guessing games, The careful edits I had to make in my own presence just to fit the version of me they could tolerate, the silence I kept wasn't about punishing them. It was about protecting myself. I started spending more time in the library downtown. They'd reopened a new wing, and I liked how the chairs were soft and the windows stretched high. I read memoirs, stories of women who had endured things. Some who had lost everything and still found ways to write about it with grace. I borrowed books on gardening, on tea culture, on aging. One morning, while returning a book on perennial herbs, I passed a flyer tacked on the community board, a class called Wills and Wisdom, hosted by a local legal clinic for older adults wanting to update their estate plans. I took a picture of the flyer. The next day, I called and registered. I didn't need to change much, just a few lines, just a few decisions, but as I sat across from the new attorney, a different one this time, I realized this was my way of reclaiming something. My voice, my choice, my future, however quiet it may be. When he asked who would be listed as my primary beneficiary, I paused. The usual answer would have rolled off my tongue a year ago: my son, his children, of course, but now my mind searched for names that brought comfort rather than pain. I thought of my friend Susan, who had driven me to George's chemotherapy appointments, of the community centre, where I volunteered on Tuesdays, folding clothes for families in need, of the animal shelter, where I once donated in memory of our old golden retriever, Daisy. I didn't rush the answer. I just told him I'd need a little time to consider, and he nodded. Outside, the trees were beginning to bloom again. It was late March. There was still chill in the air, but the daffodils had begun to push through the soil in the little patch behind the library. The seasons didn't wait for anyone to catch up. Neither did I back home. I unplugged the landline. I'd kept it just in case they ever needed to reach me, but I realized, with no bitterness, that they hadn't used it in over a year. It was time to let go of just in case, time to start living in what was. I made a small pot of lentil soup that night, played a jazz record George used to hum along with, wrote a few more lines in my journal. Today I was still. Today I did not chase. Today I belonged only to myself. There was power in that, a gentle kind, the kind you don't boast about, the kind you feel in the bones when no one else is watching. I didn't know what would come next, but I knew this: I would no longer beg for space in rooms I helped build. I would no longer explain myself to people who had decided their version of me was enough. I had gone silent, and in that silence, I was learning to hear my own voice again. It didn't happen all at once. There was no grand moment, no sweeping change, just a slow, almost invisible turning of the wheel inside me, like a clock that had quietly started ticking again after years of stillness. At first, I didn't even notice how different I was moving through my days. It started small. I began taking longer walks, not because I needed the exercise, but because I liked the way the wind moved through the trees down on Maple Lane. I liked the scent of pine needles that gathered near the corner of the old elementary school where Daniel used to play tag with his friends. I stopped checking my phone for missed messages, not in a bitter way, but because I no longer expected anything, and that absence of expectation, it was its own kind of freedom. A few weeks after I adjusted my will, I sat at my kitchen table and sorted through a box of family photos, not the curated albums I kept for guests, but the old, unfiltered ones, faded, curled at the edges, some with coffee rings on the corners. There were pictures of Daniel in his dinosaur pajamas, George, with grease on his cheek from working under the car, me in a dress I used to love before I forgot I ever wore it. For the first time, I didn't cry looking at them. I smiled, softly, not because those days weren't precious, they were, but because I'd stopped anchoring myself to them as proof of who I was supposed to be. I let the woman in those photos be part of my story without needing to carry her weight anymore. One morning, I took 3 bags of clothes and donated them to the shelter downtown. Among them was the pale blue dress I'd planned to wear to the wedding. I ran my hand along the thread at the cuff before folding it into the bag. It was a lovely dress. It deserved to be worn by someone who would be seen. That same week, I accepted an invitation to a community lecture on historical architecture. I almost didn't go. I hadn't been to anything like that in years. But I remembered George used to say, "You're never too old to learn something that makes you sit up straighter." So I went, and I liked it. I liked the quiet shuffle of papers in the hall. The way people turned to each other to whisper comments about rooflines and cornices. I liked that no one knew my name, not yet. There was a kind of peace in being anonymous again, but this time on my own terms. A woman named Frances sat beside me. She had kind eyes and a scarf tied around her neck in a way that made her look like she belonged in a painting. We spoke briefly about the speaker's accent and the pastries in the lobby. When the event ended, she asked if I'd be attending. The next one, I said I might, and I did. We became casual friends, not the kind who share everything, but the kind who wave when they see each other across the park and stop to sit together in the sun. It was enough. Around that time, I also started volunteering more at the second-hand bookshop near the train station. I had stopped in one afternoon, looking for a gardening guide, and left with a small stack of paperbacks and a conversation with the owner. He was a kind man in his 60s. And when I mentioned I had once catalogued George's entire vinyl collection, he laughed and said, "Sounds like you know your way around shelves." It became a little ritual. Tuesdays and Thursdays, a few hours at the shop, dusting, sorting, labeling. I liked the smell of old pages, the soft creak of the floorboards. Sometimes customers would ask for recommendations, and I'd steer them toward something with a quiet kind of magic, the kind of story that unfolds slowly and leaves something behind. I hadn't realized how much I needed that rhythm, not just the activity, but the feeling of being useful again in a way that didn't involve sacrificing myself. There were still pangs, of course. Days when I'd see a family in the cafe window and wonder what it would feel like to be part of something again. But those moments passed quicker now. They didn't sit on my chest the way they used to. They didn't steal whole afternoons. One day, I saw Daniel's wife in town at the market. She didn't see me at first. She was by the avocados, scrolling through her phone, cart already half full. I paused, one eye over. For a second, I thought about walking up to her, saying hello, asking about the boys. But I didn't, not out of spite. I just realized there was nothing I needed from her anymore. No apology, no explanation. The story we had written together was finished, and I was already living the next chapter. So I turned, picked up my eggs, paid in cash, walked home the long way. That night, I made myself a little celebration dinner: pan-seared trout with lemon, a glass of crisp white wine, a slice of cherry pie I didn't share with anyone. After dinner, I wrote something in my journal that I hadn't been ready to admit. Until then, I am not who they left behind. I am who stayed, who kept growing, who turned silence into soil, and began again. It didn't matter if Daniel ever understood what he had done, or if his wife ever felt a flicker of remorse. That was no longer my weight to carry. I had carried enough. Now I carried only what was mine. That weekend, I bought myself a music box. Not an expensive one, just a simple wooden piece with a tiny silver key. When I turned it, it played Edelweiss. George used to hum it under his breath while washing dishes. I set it on my bedside table. Each night, I wound it once, just once. Let the notes drift through the dark like a lullaby to the woman I used to be and a reminder to the woman I was becoming. I moved differently now, and that was more than enough. It's a strange thing, watching your absence ripple through lives. That once took you for granted. You never plan for it. You don't sit and scheme. You just begin to disappear, little by little. Until one day you're no longer where they expected you to be, and that absence has shape, has weight. That's when they start to notice. I think it began with the birthdays. For years, I had sent the boys handwritten cards with little notes inside, not just happy birthday, but memory stories about when they were small, or things I remembered from their father's childhood that might have made them smile. Alongside the cards, I'd always tucked in a small check, not extravagant, but enough to feel special. This year, for the first time, I sent nothing. I didn't forget. I just chose not to. I'd spent too long giving to people who had come to expect it, not appreciate it. A week after Elliot's birthday passed, I got a text from Daniel. It was short, uncertain. "Hey Mom, hope you're okay. Just checking in." There was no mention of the missed card, no open admission of hurt. Just that shallow knock on a door they thought might still open if tapped lightly. I didn't respond, not because I was angry, but because I didn't owe him anything anymore, not even reassurance. The thing people never seem to understand about mothers is that we don't fall apart all at once. We're quiet earthquakes. We tremble in place for years before we finally shift, and when we do, the whole landscape changes. I heard from a neighbor, Evelyn, sweet Evelyn, that Daniel had shown up one afternoon, parked across from the house, sat in his car for 10 minutes, then drove away. She said he looked nervous, restless, like a man rehearsing a conversation he knew might not go the way he hoped. I didn't see him. I was at the bookstore, sipping mint tea with Francis and laughing about a misprinted copy of a Jane Austen novel that called Mr. Darcy Mr. Derry throughout. It was one of those small joys that stitched together my days now. Daniel never came back. I suppose he thought the silence was temporary, that I was just cooling off. As people like to say when they've hurt someone but want to keep the power of forgiveness within their reach. But this wasn't temporary. This was the result of years, layers. Absences stacked like stones until they formed a wall I no longer had the strength or desire to climb. I saw them again 3 months later, at the grocery store. All of them this time, Daniel, his wife, and the boys. They passed me near the frozen food aisle. Elliot saw me first. He's 17 now. Nearly grown, he gave me a small, uncertain wave, almost instinctive, like a child still remembering the shape of safety. I nodded gently, no smile, just acknowledgement. His brother, Matthew, looked away quickly, pretending to be interested in a box of waffles. Daniel didn't speak, neither did his wife. But her face changed when she saw me. Not anger, not regret. Something smaller, something closer to an ease. I didn't stop walking. When I reached the checkout, the cashier complimented the tulips in my cart. I smiled and told her they were for the kitchen table, a little tradition I'd started just for myself. It struck me, standing there, that I no longer needed them to see me. I was no longer waiting at a window. I was not a puzzle missing from their life. I was the picture they chose not to look at, and now they had to live with that blank space. What they lost wasn't a babysitter or a cheerful holiday card. They lost the warmth of a presence that never asked for anything but love in return. They lost someone who remembered how Daniel hated peas and always removed the crusts from his sandwiches. Someone who knew which lullaby each boy preferred on nights they couldn't sleep. Someone who kept the stories of their family's laughter stitched into memories like quilt squares. They lost the keeper of things, not money, not property, but meaning. And when you lose that, when you discard the person who holds the quiet, sacred pieces of your past, there's no way to fill that space again. You can hire help, you can buy gifts, you can write apologies, but you can't reclaim a history you've abandoned. A few weeks after that encounter in the store, I received an envelope in the mail. No return address, just my name written in a familiar hand. Inside was a folded sheet of notebook paper. "Mum," it began, then silence for 3 inches. And finally, "I don't know how to fix this." I read it once, then folded it again and tucked it between the pages of a gardening book on the shelf. Not out of cruelty, but because I didn't have the answer either, and I was done holding the responsibility for everyone else's remorse. Some might think I should have responded, that I should have offered a bridge. But here's the truth: bridges only matter if both sides want to meet in the middle. I had crossed. Too many alone. My absence was not a punishment, it was a decision, to live with peace instead of proximity, to belong to my own story, rather than playing a silent role in theirs, and with each day that passed, I found myself lighter, more rooted like a tree, finally growing in the direction of the sun, no longer bending toward the shadows just because they looked familiar. The world did not end when I stepped away, but theirs became a little emptier. They just don't know it yet. It started as a note, just a few lines scribbled on the back of a grocery list. I had been reaching for a recipe in the drawer and instead pulled out a scrap of paper that held no value until it suddenly did. I had just come in from the garden, dirt still under my nails, a little ache blooming in my knees, and something I can't say what urged me to write, not for anyone else, not for an audience. Just for myself. The paper said, I did not ask for much, only to be seen, only to be remembered when the table was set. That was it. But the moment I wrote it, I knew I wasn't finished, so I found a proper notebook, a fresh one. Tucked away with old stationery and unused stamps, I opened to the first page and wrote again, only this time I gave it a heading, "To the woman I used to be." What followed wasn't planned, it wasn't tidy, but it poured out steady and surprising like rain you didn't expect. I wrote about the girl I had been at 23. Moving into her first house with a baby in her arms and a future too wide to see the edges of. I wrote about how she cooked dinner every night even when no one thanked her, how she curled herself around the needs of everyone else like a vine growing toward light that never quite touched her. I told her I was proud of her, that she had given so much, and that the giving was not a mistake. But I also told her I was sorry for the ways I let her be erased, sorry for the years I spent asking for crumbs when she had deserved feasts. Sorry that I let the silence go on so long that even her own voice started to sound like an interruption. I wrote page after page, not with blame, not with bitterness, but with truth, and truth, when written down like that, has a weight. It settles your spine, it opens your lungs. Somewhere between pages 5 and 6, I wrote a sentence that made my hand still. They uninvited me because they had already rewritten the story without me. I stared at that line for a long time, and then, for the first time in over a year, I thought about the bride, not my daughter-in-law, but the young woman who had married my grandson, the girl I had never met, never hugged, never handed a card or tied a ribbon in her hair. And I realized something. I wasn't angry at her. She had stepped into a story already in motion. She hadn't drawn the boundaries, she'd inherited them. She'd seen me through the lens someone else had handed her, and that made me want to give her something new. So I turned to a clean page and wrote her a letter. I didn't make it about the wedding. I didn't mention the invitation, or the phone call, or the ache of sitting in my pale blue dress in an empty kitchen. I told her instead about the man she had married. I told her about the day he was born, how the sky was grey, but the room was filled with light, how George had stood frozen in the hallway, unsure whether to laugh or cry, and how the nurse had to tap him on the arm to make him hold his son. I told her how Daniel used to collect leaves and press them between paper towels, how he once gave me a jar filled with dandelion fluff because he thought it looked like bottled stars. I told her the kind of boy he had been. Before the weight of adulthood and expectation hardened something in him. And then I wrote this: "You married someone with a history. I hope one day you get to know all of it, not just the parts he was taught to show. We are all the product of someone's effort. Someone's hands built the bridge you're walking on." I didn't expect her to respond. I didn't even know if she'd read it. But I sealed it, placed it in an envelope, and addressed it to her, only her. No return address. I mailed it the same day. And then, as I walked home from the post box, I felt something loosen in my chest, something I hadn't realized was still wound tight. I had said what needed saying, not to be heard, but to be whole. That night, I lit a candle on my nightstand. I placed the music box beside it, wound it once, let Edelweiss drift into the dark. And I reread the letter I had written to myself. This time I added a final line: "You are no longer waiting for someone to open the door. You have stepped into your own house." It wasn't closure, exactly, but it was peace. A peace that did not depend on anyone else's actions. A peace that came from honoring what had been and releasing what would never be. The next morning, I placed the notebook on the highest shelf in my bedroom closet, not to hide it, but to keep it safe. Because sometimes the most sacred truths are the ones we whisper to ourselves, not the ones we shout into the world. And in that whisper, I found the kind of healing no apology could offer. I had written my way back to myself, and I was finally ready to live like she deserved to be heard. I wake before the sun most days. There's something about the light just before dawn, how it brushes the walls in a cool hush. How the birds begin their songs without waiting for an audience. It's the hour when the world feels most honest, before the noise begins. That's when I feel most like myself. I start the kettle, always the same way, 2 scoops of loose leaf tea in the infuser. Water just below boiling. While it steeps, I open the back door and step out into the garden. Even in winter, I go, there's frost on the leaves now, a silver dusting that reminds me nothing lasts too long in one form. Not cold, not sorrow. I sit on the bench George built. The wood is aging, but it still holds. Much like me, my life is quiet now. Not empty, just quiet. I used to fear that kind of life, the kind without family dinners, without grandchildren's laughter echoing through the hallway, without a calendar filled with obligations. But now I see it differently. I see a life that no longer runs on anyone else's approval. A life that belongs wholly to me. In the silence, I've discovered things I never had time to notice before. The way the light falls through the kitchen blinds at 4 in the afternoon. The taste of butter on warm toast when eaten slowly. The way wind sounds different moving through pine than it does through maple. My days are stitched together with softness. Books, letters, long walks, a volunteer shift at the bookstore once a week. A phone call now and then from Susan, who has become something of a sister to me, not by blood, but by grace. Sometimes she brings soup in mason jars. Sometimes we share silence on the front porch. To women content to be seen by someone who doesn't need them to shrink, I've learned how to sit with myself. To sit without needing to prove or defend or perform. There's power in that, there's dignity. I still think about them, of course. I still picture Daniel's face when he was young. The way he used to tug on my sleeve at the grocery store asking for licorice. I remember the weight of him asleep in my lap. And I remember the last time I saw him older, guarded. A man who had somehow forgotten the shape of my voice. But I don't hold it anymore, not in the way I used to. I let the memories pass like weather, some warm, some bitter, none of them mine to control. I don't know if they think about me. Maybe they do. When the mail is quiet, or when the boys ask why Grandma doesn't visit, maybe they speak of me like a chapter they can't quite explain. Maybe I'm just a woman who once brought soup and faded into the background. That's fine. I know who I am. I am the woman who stayed upright when her name was signed away. The woman who kept her garden alive while her family let roots wither. The woman who chose silence not as surrender, but as sanctuary, and that is no small thing. There's a tree at the edge of my yard, a cherry blossom that blooms fiercely every spring. Last year, I tied a blue ribbon to one of its branches, the same ribbon I had once saved to wear in my hair for the wedding I was never meant to attend. It fluttered in the wind for weeks. Then, one morning, it was gone, carried off, perhaps, or taken by a bird for some nest I'll never see, and somehow that felt right. Not everything we hold is meant to remain with us. Some things are meant to be given away, set loose, so we can learn the difference between clinging and letting go. This morning, I sat down at the table with a cup of tea and opened a letter from a young woman I'd met at the bookstore. She had found an old copy of a novel I'd recommended and wanted to thank me. She said my presence had become something. She looked forward to a quiet light in her routine. I read it twice, not because it said anything extraordinary, but because it reminded me that we can still matter. Even when the ones we loved forget how to see us, we can still leave echoes, not through grand gestures or perfect legacies, but through gentle consistencies, through kindness, through truth. There is a kind of legacy in simply being good to yourself. I don't know what tomorrow brings. I don't plan far ahead anymore. I keep a small journal where I note what made me smile each day. Yesterday, a squirrel balancing on the bird bath. Today, the warmth of this tea. It's enough. I used to think I needed a reconciliation to feel complete. A phone call, an apology, some tearful reunion on a porch or in a hospital room. But now I see that healing doesn't always come in scenes like that. Sometimes healing is just waking up and no longer feeling like someone else's absence defines you. Sometimes healing is learning how to sit alone at your table and feel full, not with bitterness, not with pride, but with quiet certainty that you are still here, still whole, still worthy of a life that belongs entirely to you. I'm not angry. I'm not waiting. I'm not even sad anymore. I'm simply here surrounded by the sound of wind and birdsong and my own breath, and that, after everything, is beautiful. It was early autumn when the phone finally rang. A real ring, not a scam number, not a neighbor calling to borrow a rake, not the cheerful reminder from the pharmacy about my refill. It was Daniel. His name appeared on the screen the way a ghost might appear in the corner of a room you thought you'd sealed off for good. It didn't bring panic, just stillness. I stood with the phone in my hand, letting it ring once, twice, 5 times, then I let it go to voicemail. He didn't leave a message. Instead, I stared out the window, where the wind was shaking loose the first of the yellow leaves from the birch trees. One by one, they drifted to the ground. I counted them without meaning to. 7, 8, 9. By the time the phone rang again, I was already sitting. This time I answered. His voice was quiet, slower than I remembered, not cracked with emotion, just tired, like a man speaking from the bottom of a long road. He said hello. He said my name like it had weight to it now, like it wasn't just a formality, but a name he hadn't earned the right to use so easily. He asked how I'd been. I didn't answer. He apologized. That's what he'd called to do. Not for one thing. Not for the forged signature, or the wedding, or the silence, but for all of it. He said it without flowery language, without excuses, just an acknowledgement that something had broken. And he knew he was the one who broke it. He said he had read the letter, not the one to the bride. I still don't know if she ever shared it, but the one I had written to myself and left on the table the day I moved my legal documents to the attorney's office for safekeeping. He must have found it, or perhaps someone handed it to him. Either way, he had read it, and something in it, he said, stayed with him. He asked if I'd like to talk. Not today, he said, but maybe sometime over coffee or a walk. I let the silence fill the space between us before I answered. I told him I had nothing left to explain, no more stories to offer, no more questions to ask. That I had spent too many years waiting for someone to come back to a version of me they never truly saw. But I also said this, I wasn't angry anymore. I told him I was living quietly, that I had built a life without the ache of being misunderstood. And that while I didn't have space for old expectations, I did have space for truth if he knew how to carry it. He didn't reply right away. Then he said something I hadn't expected. He said, "I don't know how to make things right, but I'm still here." I think, in a way, that was the most honest thing he'd ever said to me. I told him I'd think about it. That's all. No promises, no invitations, just that after the call ended. I sat by the window again. A few more leaves had fallen, the light had softened. I held the phone in my lap and exhaled. Not relief, not sadness, just a slow breath, the kind you take when something old finally stops hurting in the same way. The next day, I returned to my usual rhythm, the bookstore, the garden, tea with Francis. Nothing had shifted outwardly, no grand reconciliation, no weeping reunion. But inside, something had cracked, just slightly open, not to let someone in, but to let something out, a measure of grief I hadn't realized I was still carrying. I began writing again. Not letters this time, but little reflections, one each day, a kind of journal, but simpler, 1 page per entry. October 3rd, the light changed in the afternoon. The porch smelled like warm cedar. I felt okay. October 4th, heard children laughing on the corner. Didn't feel jealous, just smiled. October 5th, Daniel called again. I didn't answer. I wasn't ready. And that's all right. The pages began to collect. And with them, a pattern. I wasn't writing toward healing, I was writing from within it. That's the thing no one tells you about forgiveness. It doesn't always mean re-entry. It doesn't mean the doors open wide again and everyone comes in for tea. Sometimes forgiveness just means loosening the rope around your own chest, letting go of the question, why didn't they love me better? And instead asking, how can I love myself more fully now? By mid-October, Daniel left a letter in my mailbox, handwritten, sealed. I placed it in the top drawer of my desk and left it unopened for a week. Then one rainy morning, I read it. It was clumsy, raw, some parts tried too hard, some parts didn't go far enough, but it was honest. He spoke of fear of growing older and not knowing how to connect, of regret. Not just for what he'd done, but for what he never gave. He wrote about his sons, now nearly grown, and how he saw pieces of me in them he hadn't noticed before. He didn't ask to come back, he simply said he hoped I was well. And that, for now, was enough. Sometimes all we really want is to know that we are not forgotten. I replied with a postcard, a picture of my garden in spring, tulips in full bloom. On the back, I wrote one line, I hope they remember the kindness that built them. I didn't sign it. He would know my life is still quiet, but now it is room for gentle endings. For letters without replies, for conversations that don't need conclusions, just acknowledgement. Not everything broken can be fixed, but some things, if we let them, can still soften around the edges. And that softening, in the end, is its own kind of grace.